Let's take a trip around the world with war correspondent Hollie McKay. I'm Jenna, and this is Smarter News. All right, let's just jump right in. Hollie is with us today. Hollie is a war correspondent, published author, world traveler, mother. I like to add that too, Hollie, because you balance so many different things. And you're going to take us a little bit on a trip around the world with some of our big foreign policy or overseas stories. So let's just talk with this developing story. We heard from President Trump in the beginning of April that there were going to be direct talks with Iran. He's talked a lot about Iran and wanting something from this country to move forward. Talk to us a little bit about where these talks are and what to expect this week.
Right. So this is a really important story. If we remember, in Trump's first term, he basically ripped up the Iran deal that President Obama had formed. And here we are back at the negotiating table. So there's a lot of questions over whether Trump is going to be able to get a better deal and what a better deal looks like. And as reports indicate, Iran is actually very close to developing nuclear weapons. And it could just be, a matter of weeks or months if things fall through. So there is a lot at stake. They recently had talks. Representatives were in Rome from both countries. So far, the media reports are basically saying that there is progress reported, which basically means that Tehran and Washington are somewhat seeing eye to eye, and the talks will continue this week in Oman. So there is a lot of criticism about even having the talks. A lot of people that are very anti-Iran, or especially the Israelis, they're not happy about sort of what is happening. For obvious reasons, don't feel that Iran can be trusted with any type of deal, and that basically they will get sanctions relief and money in their pocket that they can then go and spend on wars in the region. So there is a lot at stake kind of either way, but the only other alternative to an actual deal on paper is a military solution.
And that's what President Trump has said that he doesn't want, but that he's leaving the door open. Iran is a State Department or U.S. government designated state sponsor of terrorism, meaning that it's one of 4 countries that has this special designation for supporting terrorist groups around the world. Syria, Cuba, North Korea are the others. Can you explain to our audience the stakes here when we think about, and you've done so much reporting on, different terrorist groups in the region of the Middle East that receive support from Iran and what that could look like if Iran does indeed get a nuclear weapon?
Yeah, there is a lot at stake. And I have to point out, Iran is in a significantly weaker position than it has been 3 years ago. It was in a much stronger state than it is today. And that is due in large part to the fall of Syria last year and also to the ongoing war in Gaza. So basically, Iran has competed for hegemony in the region. They fund groups like the Houthis in Yemen. They give money to Hamas in Gaza. They give money to the Iraqi militias. They were also backing Bashar al-Assad and his regime and its military up until December last year. So they had a very strong foothold. They had, and of course Hezbollah. So they had a very strong foothold to be able to basically funnel weapons, from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq and beyond. But having lost some of those key areas, Iran is significantly weakened. And so they are certainly hurting for power as well as hurting for money. So the US at this point does have an upper hand in forging a deal. On the flip side of that is, whether they could take that money and bolster their weapons and bolster some of these groups, which is another very legitimate cause for concern. While Iran itself is not at war, certainly areas around it, groups around it. So, they're basically a big troublemaker in the Middle East, to put it bluntly. So it's a question of whether containing the nuclear weapon possibility is more important than stopping them from funding a lot of these groups that basically are designated terrorist groups and do cause a lot of harm.
When you were listing off those different groups, you think about how many news stories that Iran is a part of, even when you're not actually talking about Iran. So something definitely to watch. We'll see if there's progress on those talks this week. Let's move to an actual nuclear state. Russia reportedly has the most nuclear weapons of any country in the world, including more than the United States. And we are just seeing a developing story today. So we're speaking on Tuesday afternoon, April 22nd. There are reports that there could be an opening for Russia and Ukraine to have direct talks. You've spent time in Ukraine during this war. How significant is it to even see reports that this is possible, and what does it mean?
I think it's very significant that either side would have a discussion. For a long time, this definitely wasn't on the table. Although I do think still at this point, from everything that I'm seeing and reading and understanding from people on the ground, is both sides are incredibly far off in what they see appropriate terms for a ceasefire or ending the war altogether. Obviously, Moscow wants recognition of the territories that it has already taken, whereas it's a really hard pill for Ukraine to swallow, given that that is technically Ukrainian territory and that they were the ones that were invaded. So to have to concede to that is something that right from the beginning, President Zelensky said that he was not willing to do. But of course, the US is pushing for some sort of deal. And in any type of deal, both sides are going to have to make concessions and also weigh up, is bringing an end to the war going to be a higher priority than trying to retain, as much land, because really, as it is at this stage, it is a territorial deadlock. Neither side is necessarily winning. I think that's been a big source of frustration for the Trump administration, that I think they wanted to come in and get this deal happening very quickly. We're several months into the administration now. That hasn't happened. So that is frustrating. And so then there are a lot of questions as the US has threatened to walk away from trying to be the arbiter in this. Then what would happen? Does that mean the US then decides it's not giving Ukraine any more weapons, any more aid? Will that enable a Russian victory in the end? So there are a lot of questions as to how the US will kind of take things if there isn't some kind of deal put on the table.
What do you think has changed? I mean, what does your gut tell you about what changed to lead to even a headline to suggest there was an opening for direct talks?
I think it is pressure from the administration. I think at this point, if the US was to sort of say, well, we've done everything we can, you're on your own now, I think that is it's not a great position for either country to be in on the world stage. It's not really clear what happens militarily from there. And I think that both sides are trying to portray themselves as sort of the sensible person in the room. And if they can't come to some kind of agreement, it paints a picture of two sides warmongering rather than two sides that are trying to end a conflict.
And then we're right into that situation of an endless war that has been talked about and referred to by the Trump administration and others, quite frankly, for the last several years. Okay, so we'll continue to watch to see if there's developments there. I want to ask you about this other story you've been looking into. You sent me a note last week about it, and it's something I actually hadn't heard talked about quite a bit, Hollie. So I'm excited to get your perspective on this. We're going to go back to the Middle East, and we're going to talk about Saudi Arabia's relationship with Syria, specifically when it comes to debt. Can you tell us a little bit about this topic, why you're looking into it, and why does it matter?
Well, as you can imagine, Syria, another state sponsor of terrorism for 40 odd years, it has accumulated a lot of debt, not only from this long-running civil war that happened, but Bashar's father, who was in charge before that, also ran up a lot of debt as well, to the tune of, you're looking at just to the World Bank itself, the loans that come from that, $3.4 billion. And that is a very small amount in the bigger picture. That doesn't include huge amounts of reconstruction, but that is basically the loans that it is in debt to. Again, a lot of this is dating back to the 70s and 80s. So recently, just in the last week, basically Saudi Arabia kind of came in and said, we'll wipe this debt, we'll pay for it. The Saudis clearly have a lot of money, but they certainly aren't doing anything just to be philanthropic to their neighbor. That's not the sole purpose here. So what I think is really interesting was, what does this mean for Saudi Arabia to own this debt? So basically, and why are they doing this? Number one, strategic influence. So they are re-engaging Syria economically. Mind you, during the war, Bashar was very close with Iran. That is Saudi Arabia's number one enemy. So this is a chance for the Saudis to kind of get back in and have that strategic influence that it hasn't had for a very, very long time. They also, again, it's to counter Iran. It's to ensure that Iran sort of is not able to come back in and take that ownership of Syria that it once had. And I think it's also a little bit of a regional realignment.
Yeah, it's very fascinating to think about that. And when you talk about MBS, you're talking about Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud. He's the prime minister of Saudi Arabia. MBS came to the United States, as some of our audience might remember, did like a little bit of a charm tour around the United States, didn't he, Holly, as like, representing a new face of Saudi Arabia. And then after he met with some high profile people, they found out that their phone had been hacked. Wasn't that am I remembering this story correctly? I believe that was the case.
Yeah. He's a complex figure. On one hand, trying to modernize Saudi Arabia, trying to bring the country forward, but at the other times, obviously, human rights records. His approach to doing things is a little bit not how we do things here as a democracy.
Yeah, very interesting. Important to keep an eye on Saudi Arabia. And a reminder for us too here when it comes to the U.S. economy, when someone owns a little bit of your debt, they have a little bit more than just a string to you. And it's what's on the other side of that that's important to remember. So this definitely gives us something to think about. Holly, a great trip around the world with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.